John Miller, a weary veteran in his 60s, thought the cabin he bought for just $50 was nothing more than a crumbling shelter where he and his loyal German shepherd, Rex, could find peace. But on their very first night, Rex's frantic barking led John beneath the rotting floorboards, where a hidden metal box revealed secrets buried for decades. What they uncovered wasn't just worth millions. It was a discovery powerful enough to change their lives, and maybe even the world. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. The winter sky hung low over the town of Ashford, a small settlement on the edge of Montana's rugged wilderness, where the wind tore through empty streets like a restless spirit. The snow had fallen for 3 straight days, smothering cars beneath white mounds, freezing gutters into jagged teeth, and painting the rooftops with a pale stillness that made the entire town feel abandoned. The courthouse building, a squat structure of red brick worn down by decades of storms, glowed faintly through frosted windows. Inside, the community gathered, boots dripping onto the wooden floor, coats pulled tight against the draft. They were here for the county auction, a ritual where dreams were sold cheap and hopes were sometimes buried under the weight of bad decisions. In the back row, sitting a little apart from the chatter, was John Miller. John was 65. His age carried not only in the silver hair that brushed against the collar of his worn flannel shirt, but also in the deep lines carved across his weather-beaten face. His eyes were a shade of gray that seemed to hold winter itself, steady and cold, but behind them flickered the ember of a man who had once been unstoppable. A veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, John had carried scars no surgeon could stitch. The memory of firefights echoing through humid jungles, the cries of brothers lost, the smell of gunpowder and burning earth. His hands, thick and calloused from years of turning wrenches as a mechanic after the war, clenched tightly around the bitter's paddle he had been handed at the door. His beard was trimmed short but patchy, streaked with white, and his jawline had the stubborn sharpness of someone who had always chosen to endure rather than to yield. John was not a man who complained. Life had taken his wife, Mary, 2 winters ago to lung cancer, and his children had moved far away, one to Texas, one to Ohio, chasing lives too busy to include him. He had learned not to expect visits. The only soul who stayed by his side was Rex. Rex lay at his feet, the large German shepherd's thick black and tan coat dusted with snow from their walk across town. At 10 years old, Rex was past his youthful bounding, his muzzle touched with gray, but his amber eyes still gleamed with sharpness and loyalty. He had been with John since a pup, a gift from Mary when she said he needed someone to talk to during long nights in the garage. Rex had grown into more than a dog. He was John's shadow, his confidant, his guard against the emptiness that threatened to drown him. The dog had a scar across his right flank, the result of a fight years earlier with a wild coyote near the outskirts of town, a memory that only deepened the creature's aura of toughness. Rex was steady, cautious, and unshakably loyal, never leaving John's side. As John sat, Rex's head rested across his boot, ears twitching at the chatter of the crowd. The auctioneer, a broad-shouldered man named Carl Hendricks, stepped onto the Showmall, small platform at the front of the room. Carl was in his 50s, his hair thinning but combed with care, his cheeks red from the cold, and his voice seasoned by years of calling bids at county fairs. He wore a thick brown coat that he never bothered to remove, as if the chill was permanent in his bones. Carl was known for being both quick-witted and sharp-tongued, the sort of man who could make a joke at your expense and leave you laughing anyway. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the hall. "Today we have something for everyone. Commercial, residential, and yes, even the adventurous among you who fancy a project." Laughter rippled across the benches. One by one, properties were sold off. Empty lots, decrepit storefronts, parcels of land too rocky for farming. Then came the item John had been waiting for. "Next up," Carl announced, lifting a sheet of paper, "a rural cabin located 5 miles out of town, once owned by the late Henry Blackwood, abandoned since the mid-1980s, structure standing, but in severe disrepair. No utilities, no plumbing, roof compromised. Starting bid, $50. The crowd erupted with low chuckles. A tall man in a pristine denim jacket muttered, "That place should be torn down, not sold." A woman with a baby on her lap whispered to her neighbor, "I heard raccoons live in it now." John heard them all, but kept his gaze steady. To most, the cabin was worthless, but to him it represented something priceless. Purpose. He was tired of the apartment he rented in town, with its peeling wallpaper and neighbors who looked at him like a relic. He wanted wood beneath his hands, the smell of pine smoke in his clothes, the sense of belonging to land instead of waiting for time to swallow him. $50, John called out, his voice gravelly but clear. He lifted his paddle. Carl raised his eyebrows. "We have 50 from bidder 72. Do I hear 75? From the back of the room, a younger man in polished work boots and a brand-new Carhartt jacket lifted his paddle lazily. His name was Gary Thompson, a local house flipper known for buying cheap, slapping on a coat of paint, and reselling to out-of-towners. Gary's jaw was square, his beard neatly trimmed, his blonde hair slicked back with a kind of arrogance that seemed to ooze from every pore. 75, he said with a smirk. John's stomach tightened. He had no more than $70 in his wallet, and bidding higher meant using money meant for groceries. But then he looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes met his, calm but unyielding, as though reminding him he had faced worse odds in jungles far away. 100, John said. The room went silent. Gary hesitated, clearly weighing whether the cabin was worth his effort. He leaned to his friend beside him, a wiry man with a baseball cap pulled low, and muttered something that made them both laugh. But then he shrugged, dismissing the bid. "Not worth my time," he said aloud, loud enough for others to hear. Carl's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Sold for $100 to bidder 72. There were snickers in the crowd, muttered jokes about old fool Miller wasting his money. But John barely heard them. Carl handed him a set of tarnished brass keys, one large and ornate, clearly for the cabin door, and another smaller one whose purpose was not described. John turned them over in his rough hand, the weight of the metal sinking deep into him. They weren't just keys to a cabin, they were keys to a chance. As the crowd dispersed, John pulled his coat tighter and stepped back into the biting cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Rex padded at his side, tail swishing once in approval. For the first time in years, John felt something stir in his chest. Not joy exactly, but determination. The same feeling that had carried him through firefights and sleepless nights on foreign soil. The cabin might be broken, but it was his. And perhaps, with enough grit, it could be made whole again. The road to the cabin wound like a pale ribbon through the snowy forest, where skeletal pines leaned against the biting wind, and the earth lay silent under its frozen blanket. John's old pickup groaned with every turn, its muffler rattling and the tires struggling for grip on icy patches, but he kept his hands firm on the wheel. Rex sat in the passenger seat, his head level with the window, nose pressed against the glass, ears perked forward as though he could sense the gravity of this journey. The brass keys Carl had given him lay heavy in his coat pocket, their weight a constant reminder of the decision he had made at the courthouse. When the truck finally lurched into a small clearing, John stopped and gazed at the structure that would be his new beginning. The cabin was worse than he had imagined. Its roof sagged beneath decades of snow and rain, blackened shingles hanging loose like rotten teeth. Moss and vines clung to the timbers, swallowing whole sections of the walls. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the dim winter light, while the front porch leaned precariously to one side, as if it had long since surrendered to gravity. Still, beneath the ruin, John saw bones of craftsmanship, logs cut thick, hand-hewn beams, and the faint outline of a home that once stood proud in the wilderness. He turned off the engine, and the silence of the forest rushed in, broken only by Rex's low, curious whine. John stepped out, boots crunching through the snow, and tested the porch with a careful foot. The wood groaned but held his weight. He slid the large brass key into the lock, turned it with effort, and pushed the swollen door open. A wave of cold, stale air hit him, carrying the scent of mildew, dust, and the faint metallic tang of rust. Rex padded in first, tail low but alert, sniffing every corner. Inside, the cabin was a skeleton of neglect. The floorboards were warped, some buckling up like ribs beneath a skin of dirt. Mold crept along the corners where the roof had leaked, staining the walls in shades of green and black. A fireplace at the far end was clogged with years of soot and debris, and the remains of broken furniture lay scattered. A chair missing 2 legs, a table cracked down the middle, shelves warped beyond repair. The air was heavy, pressing down like a memory that had been sealed too long. John removed his gloves, rubbed his rough palms together, and muttered, "We'll make it work, Rex." Somehow the dog gave a sharp bark, as if in agreement, then suddenly froze, ears forward, nose pressed to the warped boards near the hearth. Rex began to scratch furiously at the floor, claws raking against the wood. A deep growl vibrated in his chest, not of threat, but of insistence. John frowned, crouched beside him, and ran his hand across the floor. One of the planks felt loose beneath his touch. With effort, he pried it up, the nails shrieking in protest, and beneath lay a dark cavity. Dust billowed upward, making him cough. From the hollow space, he pulled out a metal box no larger than a briefcase, its surface dulled by rust, the edges dented but its lock still intact. For a long moment, John simply stared at it, his mind rushing with questions. Who had hidden it? Why had Rex been drawn to it so fiercely? He carried it to the broken table, brushed away the dust with his sleeve, and studied the lock. It was simple enough. Years as a mechanic had taught him to handle stubborn bolts and catches. With a screwdriver from his coat pocket and a bit of force, the lock snapped open. The lid creaked on its hinges, and inside lay a collection of objects that seemed to breathe with history. The first was a bundle of letters, their envelopes yellowed and fragile, ink faded but still legible. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, belonging to someone educated. He unfolded one carefully and read, "To whoever finds this, I fear my time is running out. They are coming for me, for my work, and I cannot let it fall into their hands. I leave these notes in the hope that someone with integrity will carry forward what I could not finish." The letter was signed, Henry Blackwood. Beneath the letters were hand-drawn maps on parchment-like paper, edges frayed, marked with symbols and coordinates. Streams, ridges, and landmarks were sketched in precise lines, accompanied by notes in the same careful script. At the bottom of the box lay notebooks bound in leather, pages filled with diagrams, strange, intricate designs of gears, coils, and circuits unlike anything John had ever seen. His brows furrowed as he traced the lines with his finger. He had seen electrical schematics during his service when he worked repairing field equipment, but these were more advanced, almost visionary, as though written by someone decades ahead of their time. As he turned the pages, a name surfaced repeatedly: harmonic energy converter. John didn't understand it fully, but the repetition of measurements, symbols, and annotations suggested something far more significant than idle invention. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, the memories of war pressing close again. He had seen men die for scraps of information, battles fought over rumors of new technology. The idea that a man named Henry Blackwood had worked on something powerful enough to hide here in the woods stirred an unease he hadn't felt in years. Rex nudged his leg, sensing his unease. John reached down, scratching the dog behind the ears, grounding himself in the present. "Looks like we're not the first souls to think this cabin meant more than rotten wood," he murmured. Later, as night fell, John lit a lantern he had brought with him and sat at the broken table with the box's contents spread before him. Shadows danced on the mold-stained walls. The wind howled outside, and the cabin creaked like it was groaning from the weight of secrets. He read through more of the letters. Henry described being approached by government agents, men who offered contracts laced with veiled threats. He wrote of nights spent hearing footsteps outside, of letters missing from his desk, of a creeping paranoia that grew until he abandoned the cabin. One line struck John hardest. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed to keep it safe. But perhaps you can succeed where I could not." John exhaled slowly, the words sinking deep into him. He thought of Mary, of her soft voice urging him to keep going when the weight of survival seemed too heavy. He thought of the empty apartment in town and the way his children's voices had grown distant on the phone. Maybe this cabin wasn't just a last chance at living with purpose. Maybe it was destiny thrust into his hands, carried to him by Rex's bark and the pull of fate. As the lantern sputtered low, John gathered the papers back into the box and slid it under his arm. He had no idea what exactly Henry's work represented or why it had been buried under floorboards for decades, but he knew one thing: it was his responsibility now. He looked down at Rex, whose eyes reflected the faint glow of the lantern, unwavering, loyal. "We found something, old boy," John whispered, "and I've got a feeling it's going to change everything." The nights at the cabin were long and bitter, the wind clawing at the walls as if trying to pull the place apart. But John had lived through far worse. He set up his small camping stove in the fireplace where the chimney still carried smoke upward, spread an old wool blanket across the floor for Rex, and sat hunched by the flickering light of a lantern. On the table lay the metal box he had found, and beside it the leather-bound journal of Henry Blackwood. Its cover was cracked, the stitching along the spine frayed, but the moment John had opened it, he knew it contained more than idle musings. It carried the weight of a man's final hopes. He began reading page by page, Rex stretched out with his head on John's boot, listening to the rise and fall of his master's voice, as though he too could feel the urgency within the words. The first entries were ordinary, notes about weather, hunting, repairs to the cabin, but as the weeks progressed, the tone changed. Henry described himself as a man of medium build, fair-skinned, with dark hair that had grayed early at the temples, eyes always red-rimmed from too many nights at the drafting table. John pictured him sitting here decades ago, shoulders stooped, ink staining his fingers, driven not by greed, but by a fierce belief that he was on the verge of something monumental. Henry's words painted him as brilliant yet haunted. He had been an engineer during the late 1950s, educated at MIT, where his peers respected him for his unconventional ideas. But it was after he joined a private research consortium in the 1960s that his life began to unravel. The journal shifted into confessions. Henry had stumbled upon principles of resonance energy, what he called harmonic conversion. The ability to draw power not from fuel or sun or wind, but from vibrations inherent in the fabric of matter itself. His notes grew feverish, sketches filling the margins of circles within circles, coils and chambers labeled with calculations that John only half understood. He wrote of sleepless nights when equations danced in his head, when he could almost hear the hum of energy waiting to be released. John leaned closer, recognizing certain patterns, remembering long hours in Vietnam, repairing broken radios under fire, cobbling together power units from scavenged parts. Henry's diagrams were far beyond that, but the fundamentals, current, resistance, coils, were real, not fantasy. Further entries darkened. Henry described visits from men he never named, only called the officials. They came in pressed suits, clean-shaven faces, voices smooth as silk, promising funding if he signed away his patents, threatening obscurity if he refused. They said his converter could power cities, but also weapons, entire fleets running forever without fuel. Henry distrusted them. "I cannot give this to men who see war as profit," one entry declared. "Better that my work rot beneath the floorboards than feed the engines of destruction." John read that line 3 times, feeling the echo of his own life in it. He too had watched young men torn apart in wars that promised glory, but delivered only coffins. He knew what it was to mistrust those in power, to recognize how easily technology could be twisted into death. As the nights wore on, John made the journal his companion. He read by lantern until his eyes burned, pausing only to stoke the fire or feed Rex scraps of jerky. One entry detailed how Henry had once lived with a woman named Margaret, slender with auburn hair and pale, freckled skin, a librarian who believed in him when no one else did. She had left when the officials' pressure grew too intense, telling him she would not live in fear. Her absence broke something in Henry, turning him from hopeful inventor into recluse. John imagined him pacing these same warped floorboards, the hollow thud of footsteps echoing through empty rooms, the silence pressing in as paranoia replaced companionship. Yet even in despair, Henry's brilliance persisted. One passage described a prototype hidden beneath the cabin, a device small enough to power the lights of the cabin for weeks on end. He dismantled it when the officials returned, scattering pieces into different hiding places around the property. If one day someone worthy finds these fragments, perhaps they will assemble what I could not finish. John rubbed his beard, thoughts churning. Worthy. Did that word apply to him? A broken old veteran whose greatest skill now was keeping an ancient truck alive and fixing lawn mowers for neighbors? But then he looked at Rex, whose steady gaze never wavered, and he thought perhaps worthiness was not about education or wealth, but endurance, loyalty, the refusal to surrender even when life pressed hardest. John began sketching notes of his own in the margins of Henry's work, testing whether the logic held. He found himself transported back to the garage where he once taught his son to hold a wrench before his boy grew impatient with the slow life and left for the city. His hand trembled as he wrote, but the knowledge returned like muscle memory. He saw how Henry's coils might function, how resonance could be tuned like a guitar string, and though the math stretched beyond him, the principles felt alive, buzzing at the edge of comprehension. He felt young again, as though purpose had returned. One night, while the storm raged outside, John turned a page and found an entry written in hurried, jagged strokes. "They followed me again today. I heard voices near the clearing. I fear they will not rest until my work is theirs. I must prepare." The ink was smudged, as if Henry's hand had trembled. Beneath it, a final sketch showed a chamber buried in stone, sealed with a panel that only a keen eye would notice. John's heart quickened. He glanced around the cabin, imagining secret places hidden just beyond his reach. Rex shifted restlessly, ears pricked, nose testing, the air. John set the journal down, ran his hand over the dog's thick fur, and whispered, "We'll look tomorrow, old friend. For now, we've got his story, and I think we're part of it now." He banked the fire, blew out the lantern, and lay back against the creaking wall, the journal pressed to his chest. Outside, the forest howled with secrets, but inside, John dreamed of a man he had never met, a man whose burden he now carried, and of a machine that might change everything. The morning after a night spent wrestling with Henry's words, John stepped outside into the brittle cold. The forest stretched out in all directions, an expanse of white-dusted silence broken only by the groan of trees shifting under the weight of snow. His breath rose in plumes, and beside him Rex padded eagerly, nose buried in the powder, tail swaying with a sharpness that suggested he was onto something. The journal had mentioned fragments hidden around the property, places marked only by Henry's private system of signs. John had studied those crude sketches, memorizing the lines of ridges, the shape of certain trees. Now he would see if the past would speak to him through the frozen woods. The cabin loomed behind them, its sagging roof barely visible between the pines. John adjusted the strap of his heavy coat, patted the pocket where the small brass key rested, and let Rex take the lead. The dog's paws crunched rhythmically, ears pivoting at every creak of the forest. It wasn't long before Rex stopped abruptly near a towering oak, its bark ridged and ancient. He barked once, then pressed his nose against the trunk. John leaned close, brushing away lichen, and there beneath the growth was a carving. It was not the casual whittle of a bored woodsman, but deliberate. A circle intersected by a triangle, the same symbol that had appeared in the margins of Henry's maps. John traced it with his gloved finger, a shiver crawling down his spine. They moved deeper. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of skeletal branches and uneven ground. John's boots slipped on patches of ice, his knees aching from the effort, but Rex pressed forward, nose low, intent. Soon they came to a cluster of boulders half buried in snow. One in particular bore another mark, 2 lines forming an X across its mossy surface. John crouched, brushing the snow aside. His heart beat faster. It was the same X that Henry had drawn in the sketch where he described a hidden chamber. He stepped back, scanning the clearing. The boulder was set into the side of a ridge, its base half concealed by brambles. At first it seemed like part of the landscape, immovable and solid, but when John pressed against it he felt a faint give. The stone was not natural. It had been fitted, perhaps even designed to move. Rex growled low, circling, ears pinned forward as though sensing something sacred lay beneath. John fumbled in his pocket, fingers closing around the smaller brass key he had found with the box. Its teeth were unusual, cut in a jagged pattern. He searched the rock until his hand brushed a small metal plate half buried under dirt. Heart hammering, he scraped it clean. There was a keyhole, corroded but intact. He inserted the key, twisted with effort, and heard the click echo like a gunshot through the silence. The boulder shifted with a grinding sound, sliding aside just enough to reveal a narrow opening into darkness. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of damp, earth, and rusted metal. John knelt, lantern raised, peering inside. Stone steps descended into blackness, slick with moisture. The air was heavy, pressing against his chest, but something inside him stirred. The same grit that had carried him through ambushes decades ago. He looked down at Rex, whose hackles were raised, but whose eyes gleamed with loyalty. "Looks like we found it, boy," John whispered. "Henry's hiding place." They stepped inside. The narrow stairwell swallowed them, their breaths echoing off stone. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the lantern cast trembling shadows that danced across the walls. Each step was uneven, worn, as if carved in haste by desperate hands. At the bottom lay a wooden door, reinforced with iron bands, swollen with dampness but still standing strong. John pressed his hand against it, feeling the cold seep into his skin. With a shove, the door creaked open, revealing a chamber hollowed from the rock. The room was small but purposeful. Wooden shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of boxes, jars, and bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Dust coated everything, thick as ash, but the organization was meticulous. In the center stood a workbench cluttered with parts, copper coils, glass tubes, and sheets of metal etched with fine engravings. John stepped closer, lantern high, his mechanic's mind already assembling the fragments into possibilities. Rex sniffed the air, circling the perimeter, tail swishing cautiously. On one shelf lay another journal, slimmer than the first, its pages brittle but legible. John opened it, scanning the entries. Henry described this chamber as his sanctuary, the place he fled to when the officials came too close. He wrote of nights spent working by lantern light, constructing prototypes in secret, dismantling them again when he feared discovery. His tone grew increasingly frantic, paranoia seeping through every line. "I cannot abandon my work," one passage read. "If I finish, it could free mankind. If they take it, it will enslave them." John set the journal down, his chest heavy with the burden of those words. He looked around at the fragments, the pieces of a machine that seemed half-assembled even now. He could almost hear Henry's hands at work, the clang of tools echoing against stone, the muttered calculations as he fought both his vision and his fear. John picked up a coil, its copper gleaming faintly, and imagined it humming with energy. His mechanic's instinct told him this was not madness. There was science here, waiting to be completed. As he explored further, he found crates filled with papers, diagrams of increasing complexity, and beneath them small objects wrapped in waxed cloth. One bundle contained a strange crystal, cut into a shape too precise to be natural, glowing faintly in the lantern light. John turned it over in his palm, awed by the thought that Henry had held this same piece decades ago, perhaps believing it the key to limitless energy. He set it down carefully, unwilling to risk damage. Hours passed as John catalogued the chamber in his mind, every shelf, every tool. His fingers itched to begin assembling, but he knew he must first understand. Rex eventually settled by the doorway, head on his paws, keeping guard in the patient way only an old dog could. Finally, John extinguished the lantern and sat in the cold, staring at the dark outline of the machine on the workbench. He thought of Henry alone in this place, hunted, and wondered if fate had chosen him, John Miller, an aging veteran with nothing left to lose, to be the one who would carry this work forward. The silence pressed down on him, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with possibility. The chamber beneath the ridge was colder than the forest above, the air damp and heavy with the scent of stone and iron, but John barely noticed the chill. His lantern's weak glow revealed more than shadows now. It illuminated an entire world hidden beneath decades of silence. He stood at the threshold of Henry Blackwood's buried laboratory, Rex beside him, the dog's nose twitching at the strange blend of scents: metal, oil, paper, and something faintly chemical. John stepped further inside, his boots echoing off the rock floor, and the space opened wider than he expected, a vaulted room carved meticulously into the earth. It was not just a chamber of storage, but a workshop, a place of feverish creation. On one side stood benches cluttered with tools, hammers, soldering irons, spools of copper wire, lenses, and magnifiers, all layered with dust, but still waiting for hands to bring them to life. Nearby were half-assembled machines, their frames of brass and steel shaped into curves and circles rather than the sharp lines of ordinary engines. Some had glass tubes wound with coils, others small turbines that seemed designed to spin without fuel. John's breath caught when he saw a unit no larger than a suitcase, its casing polished and fitted with dials, wires trailing like veins. He crouched and brushed it clean, recognizing from Henry's diagrams that this was not just theory, it was a working prototype. On the walls hung blueprints tacked with rusty nails, curling at the corners. They displayed sketches of devices far larger, some towering constructs that looked like they could power entire towns. At the center of the laboratory loomed the most remarkable sight of all, a circular platform 6 feet across, surrounded by concentric rings of metal. Panels of switches and gauges curved around it like a cockpit. John touched the cold steel, running his calloused fingers over the engraving Henry had left. Precise notations in tiny script, equations etched directly into the surface, as though the man had lived in such urgency he could not wait for paper. John swallowed hard, awe and fear colliding inside him. He whispered almost to himself, "You really did it, Henry." "You built it," Rex padded closer, his claws clicking softly on the stone floor, and gave a low whine as if sensing both wonder and danger. On a table near the back lay a stack of folders sealed in wax, their covers stamped with government insignias. John slit one open with his pocket knife and scanned the contents. The words leapt at him like ghosts from the past. Cease and desist order. National security violation. Unlawful research. The papers accused Henry Blackwood of violating federal law by pursuing technology deemed too dangerous for private development. Some bore signatures of officials, men who had long since died or retired, their names meaningless to most but heavy with authority. John read aloud, "Failure to comply will result in prosecution to the fullest extent of the law. All assets and intellectual property shall be seized for national defense." He slammed the folder shut, rage burning in his chest. He had seen this before. Brilliance crushed under the heel of power, progress shackled not because it was untrue, but because it was uncontrollable. John lowered himself onto a stool, head in his hands. He thought of the wars he had fought, the promises of politicians, the endless cycle of young men sent to die. If Henry's machine had worked, if it could have freed people from dependence on oil and coal, how different the world might be. He looked at Rex, whose amber eyes reflected the lantern's glow, steady and waiting. "He hid it from them," John said. "Hid it so someone like me could find it." As the hours stretched, John examined the machinery more carefully. The smaller prototype contained a crystal chamber, the same strange cut stone he had found wrapped on the shelf. He realized the crystal was not decoration, but the core of the design, acting as a resonator. The coils around it suggested energy could be drawn from vibrations, magnified and channeled. He tested switches cautiously, half expecting sparks, but the device remained dormant. It needed assembly, completion, perhaps a spark of knowledge he did not yet possess. In another corner he found a trunk filled with personal belongings. Henry's spectacles, still smudged with fingerprints, a wool coat worn thin at the elbows, a photograph of Henry as a younger man, lean with sharp features, dark eyes bright with conviction. He was standing beside a woman John guessed was Margaret, auburn-haired, tall, her hand resting on Henry's arm, both of them smiling in front of the very cabin that now stood broken above. The image ached in John's chest. a reminder that even men of genius had once known warmth before being consumed by fear. On the last workbench, he discovered a journal different from the others, this one leather-bound but embossed with initials, HB, its pages dense with hurried script. He opened to a random entry. They offered me wealth, recognition, protection. But all I saw in their eyes was hunger. They will not use it to light homes, but to power missiles. I cannot allow it. John's fingers trembled as he turned pages. The entries grew increasingly paranoid, recounting footsteps outside the cabin, knocks at the door, strangers watching from the trees. Yet amid the paranoia were calculations, detailed refinements to the harmonic converter, adjustments to crystal alignment, notes on efficiency. Even as he fell into fear, Henry had never stopped working. The lantern sputtered, threatening to die, but John could not stop reading. Every word drew him deeper into the man's torment and genius. He saw himself reflected in Henry, not in intellect, but in stubbornness, in the refusal to yield. He had spent years fixing broken machines, patching up what others would have discarded. Now fate had handed him not a broken engine, but a legacy, one that could outlive him if he chose to carry it. He pressed the journal to his chest, whispering, "I won't let it die here." Rex barked once, sharp and sudden, pulling John from his thoughts. The dog stood at the entryway to the lab, ears pinned, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway. John froze, listening. The forest above was silent, yet there was something, a faint vibration, perhaps just wind-shifting stone, or perhaps footsteps far above. He doused the lantern, leaving only the faint glow of crystal shards on the workbench. For a long while they sat in silence, man and dog, until Rex finally lowered his head, though his muscles stayed taut. John exhaled slowly. Whoever Henry had feared might still linger as shadows in this forest. He lit the lantern again, determined not to let paranoia consume him. Gathering his resolve, he locked the laboratory door behind them when they left, shifting the boulder back into place until no trace of the entrance remained. In his pack, he carried the slim journal, one of the crystals, and a folded blueprint, the first fragments of a puzzle that was now his to solve. As they trudged back to the cabin through the snow, Rex close at his side, John felt the weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. He was no longer simply a tired veteran clinging to purpose. He was a guardian of something larger than himself. That night, back in the sagging cabin above, John sat by the fire with the blueprint spread across his lap. The flames flickered, illuminating his lined face, his weary eyes, and yet beneath the weariness lay a fire to match Henry's. Rex lay curled beside him, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, the loyal companion who had led him here. John whispered into the quiet, "You didn't bury it in vain, Henry. You waited for someone to carry it forward. I'll try. God help me, I'll try." The snow had ceased by evening, leaving the forest wrapped in a brittle silence. John trudged back toward the ridge where the hidden chamber lay, lantern swinging at his side, Rex padding faithfully behind. He had carried the blueprint and journal with him for days, studying every line until they blurred, but questions gnawed at him, questions only Henry himself could answer. Some instinct, or perhaps something deeper, drew him back into the earth that night. The boulder shifted reluctantly when he pressed the hidden key into its lock, grinding aside to reveal the stairwell yawning in darkness. Rex went first, nose low, tail rigid, but his steps lacked hesitation. John followed, boots striking damp stone, breath puffing in pale bursts as they descended. At the bottom, the iron-banded door loomed again, but tonight light spilled from the cracks around its edges. Not the dim sputter of a lantern, but a steady glow that pulsed faintly, as though the machines themselves had awakened. John's pulse quickened. He gripped the handle, shoved the door open, and froze. At the workbench sat a figure. An old man, gaunt yet upright, hair like silver threads falling over his forehead, shoulders narrow beneath a threadbare wool coat. His face was a map of years, cheeks hollow, jaw sharp, lips pressed thin in concentration. A long beard, neatly kept but streaked white, framed his mouth. His hands, though knotted with age, moved with precision over the pages of an open journal. The glow came not from lanterns, but from crystalline fragments mounted in small devices on the bench, humming faintly. The man raised his head slowly, eyes catching the light. They were dark, almost black, but alive with intensity, burning with the same urgency John had read in the journal entries. John knew him without introduction. "Henry Blackwood," he breathed. Henry's voice was gravel, cracked by disuse, yet carried a steady authority. "You found what I left. And still you came back." John stepped further inside, Rex pressing at his side, tail twitching in caution. "I thought you were gone decades ago. The records said you vanished." Henry's thin mouth curved in a ghost of a smile. "Vanished, yes. Easier than letting them take everything. They tried. They came with contracts, with threats, with soldiers. I gave them nothing but silence. Silence and shadows." He coughed, a deep rattle that left his frame shuddering, then steadied himself on the table. "I have lived in these walls more years than I wish to count. Hiding. Guarding." Waiting, John studied him, taking in the wiry strength still lingering in his posture, the sharpness of a man whose mind refused to dull though his body had aged. He saw the toll paranoia had taken. Pale skin from years without sunlight, fingernails ridged and cracked, but eyes still cutting like steel. Rex broke the silence, padding forward, sniffing at Henry's boots. For a tense moment, John's hand hovered at his belt, but Rex only gave a low, approving whine before settling near Henry's chair. The dog, ever watchful, had passed judgment. John exhaled. "If Rex trusts you, that's saying something." Henry's eyes softened. He reached down, fingertips brushing the shepherd's fur. Animals know what men forget. They feel truth. They feel intent. John leaned against the bench, his voice low but unyielding. "Why leave it all here?" "Why me? I'm no genius, just a worn-out mechanic. Why not destroy it if it was so dangerous?" Henry's expression hardened, jaw tightening. "Because it is hope. Do you understand what it means to give light without burning coal, to power homes without war, to free nations from the hunger of oil? That machine," he gestured to the circular platform in the shadows, "can end their chains, but in the wrong hands, it could forge new ones. I have lived long enough to know greed is patient. If I destroyed it, the world would lose a chance at freedom. So I buried it, waiting for someone who carried not brilliance but integrity." John's throat tightened. He thought of the boys he'd carried from firefights, of Mary's gentle voice urging him to live with honor, of Rex's loyal eyes never leaving his side. He clenched his fists. "You think that's me?" Henry leaned closer, his gaze unwavering. "You endured what most cannot. You returned when you could have walked away. You carry the scars of war, yet still believe in something better. That is why it must be you. You and your companion." His eyes flicked toward Rex with quiet acknowledgement. The old man pushed the journal across the table toward John, its pages crowded with diagrams more complex than anything John had seen. "I cannot finish what I began. My body fails, but my mind has left the path. With these, you can learn. With time, perhaps you will build what I never dared to complete." John's hands shook as he touched the book, the weight of legacy pressing heavy. What if I fail? What if they come again? Henry's face, lined with grief and defiance, bent closer. Then hide it again. Bury it deeper, but never give it to them. Promise me that John's voice cracked, but he forced the word out. I promise. For a long moment, silence held the three of them, man, dog, and ghost of a legend still alive. Then Henry sat back, exhaustion pulling at his frame. Rex laid his head on Henry's boot as though sealing the pact with silent loyalty. And John, for the first time in years, felt purpose burn hotter than fear. He was not just the finder of a secret. He was its guardian now. Winter lingered over the Montana forest, though the storms had eased. Snow clung stubbornly to the branches while the ground thawed in patches, releasing the smell of damp earth. John stood outside the cabin, axe in hand, splitting the old logs that had collapsed along the fence line. His breath fogged in the air, arms straining, but his movements carried a rhythm, purpose he had not felt in years. Rex trotted nearby, his coat catching pale shafts of sunlight breaking through the clouds. The German shepherd was vigilant even while at play, bounding into the woods to chase a drifting scent, then returning to circle John's legs as if reminding him he was never alone. Inside the cabin, Henry Blackwood sat at the table near the fire. Age had not left him kindly. His hands trembled, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes remained fierce, alive with calculation. He spread blueprints across the table, pages weighted with stones to keep them flat, his pencil scratching through corrections, new calculations, sketches of refinements. When John carried in fresh wood, shaking snow from his boots, Henry raised his head, eyes glinting. "It can work," he said, voice raspy but steady. "Not just theory. I tested a smaller unit once. It lit this cabin for weeks. John set the wood down, wiping sweat from his brow. Then let's make it work again." And so began the weeks that blurred into something more than survival. John, with the patience of a mechanic, sorted through the crates of parts in the buried lab. He polished copper coils until they gleamed, reassembled turbines piece by piece, and tested circuits under Henry's guidance. The old inventor's voice was sometimes sharp, impatient when John's hands fumbled, but behind it lay gratitude. For the first time in decades, he was not alone in his work. Rex often lay beneath the bench, his steady breathing the rhythm that anchored them through long nights. John discovered he still had the knack. Years spent repairing carburetors and rewiring tractors returned in full, and though Henry's machines were decades ahead, they obeyed the same truths. Energy needed a path, coils needed balance, circuits demanded precision. He grew confident, his scarred hands steady, his gray eyes sharp again. Henry, for all his brilliance, lacked the strength to tighten bolts or lift heavy frames, so John became his hands, while Henry remained the mind. Together they bridged the gulf of years. One evening they assembled a compact prototype no larger than a toolbox. John secured the crystal chamber in its housing, while Henry adjusted the alignment of the resonance coils. "Slowly," Henry murmured, leaning in, sweat on his brow despite the cold. John flipped the switch. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the crystal pulsed with soft blue light, and the coils hummed, a low vibration that filled the chamber like the echo of a distant choir. A small bulb wired to the device flickered, then glowed. Steady. John exhaled, chest tightening. "It works," Henry's eyes shone, wet with the weight of decades. "It always worked," he whispered. "But now it has a future." The glow lit their faces, worn and lined, but for that moment both looked younger, carried by the current of hope. Rex barked once, sharp and joyful, as though sensing the shift in destiny. With time, the cabin itself began to change. John patched the sagging roof, replaced shattered windows with salvaged panes, cleared the vines from the walls. Henry directed him to reconfigure part of the living space into a workshop. The fire burned warmer each night, the shelves filled with tools neatly arranged, and the once broken cabin pulsed with life again. For neighbors who rarely ventured close, the place still looked abandoned, a ruin half swallowed by forest. But inside, it had become the heart of something extraordinary. Yet the true transformation lay not in the machines, but in John himself. He felt the weight that had haunted him since war began to lift. Each task gave him more than purpose. It gave him redemption. He no longer thought only of battles lost or of Mary's absence, but of what he could still give. He caught himself smiling more, even humming while he worked. And when Rex laid his head in his lap at night, John whispered promises of a future where the dog could run free in fields powered not by oil, but by something purer, something Henry had dreamed into being. Henry, too, softened. The paranoia that had once trapped him in shadows eased as he watched John's dedication. One night he confessed, voice quiet, "I waited for someone like you. Not a genius, not a politician, just a man who understands work, loyalty, sacrifice. You've proven I wasn't wrong to hope." John had no answer but a nod, throat tight, but in his chest burned a pride he thought he had lost long ago. They continued their work until the days grew longer, snow melting into trickling streams. One morning, John carried the prototype outside, placed it on the porch rail, and let its soft glow wash over the clearing. The forest hummed back, alive with the call of birds returning. For the first time since Mary's passing, John felt his heart lighten. He turned to Henry, who leaned on the doorway, frail but smiling, and to Rex, whose tail swept the snow. "This," John said softly, "is the real treasure. Not the money, not the power. But this," he tapped his chest. "Having something worth fighting for again." Henry closed his eyes as though sealing the words into memory. Rex barked into the forest, his voice carrying like a herald of new beginnings. And for a moment, surrounded by invention, loyalty, and the echo of hope, John believed that miracles could be born even from ruins. Sometimes the greatest treasures are not gold or silver, not even machines that can change the world, but the quiet miracles God places in our path. Loyal companions, second chances, and the strength to keep going when life feels broken. John thought he had lost everything, yet in the ruins of an old cabin he found faith, purpose, and a reminder that the Lord never abandons us. And maybe that is the lesson for us all. No matter how heavy our scars, God can turn them into doors of light. So in your daily life, when you feel tired, alone, or forgotten, remember, miracles are closer than you think, if only you dare to believe. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey. May God bless you and your family with peace, hope, and miracles in the days ahead.